Hello and welcome to Wednesday's Weekly, your weekly bite-sized briefing webinar, a collaboration between Action Together, the voluntary community and faith sector and the public sector. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this episode of our Domestic Abuse Awareness series. Action Together is working with Oldham Council to host a series of sessions about domestic abuse, and this is the third of our 4-week series. The last 2 sessions can be found on our YouTube channel. All sessions are being delivered by Kate Clark, an IDVA from Oldham Council, and today she'll be talking about the key messages from the Domestic Violence Act. Over to you, Kate.
Thank you very much and welcome everybody to today's session. So my name is Kate Clark. I'm one of the Independent Domestic Violence Advisors, otherwise known as IDVA. And we're on our 3rd session on the Domestic Abuse series. And this morning, I'm going to be talking to you about the Domestic Abuse Act 2021 and some of the key messages. So just an introduction into the Act. So the Domestic Abuse Act 2021 came into force following the Domestic Abuse Bill being agreed by the House of Commons and the House of Lords in January 2022. So the Act focuses on a new definition of domestic abuse, which hopes to highlight that domestic abuse is not just related to physical violence, it takes many other forms as well, which I will go through briefly in a moment. So the Act hopes to transform the response to domestic abuse, looking at protecting victim survivors, especially when they're going through the criminal justice system and looking at harsher punishments for perpetrators of domestic abuse. So this is something that I tend to talk about in every training I do. If this is the 3rd time you're now coming on to watch this series, you're probably thinking I've seen this before. However, I think it's really important that people are aware of the different types of domestic abuse and just what is meant by domestic abuse, because for me, you can't support with it if you don't know what it is. So domestic abuse is defined as the behaviour of one person, person A, towards another person, person B. And it's classed as domestic abuse if A and B are aged 16 or over, they are personally connected, and the behaviour is abusive. So just a quick recap of what I mean by a personal connection. So personally connected means that 2 people have been married to each other. They've been in a civil partnership with each other. They've agreed to marry one another, whether that agreement has ended or not. They've entered into a civil partnership. They've been in any sort of intimate personal relationship, whether it's a parental relationship, which might be mother-son, father-daughter, brother-sister, whatever that might be in your family dynamic, and it includes anybody who's a relative. So, for example, if we had a neighbour dispute, that would not be domestic violence. Although it may become a police matter, it wouldn't fall into the category of domestic abuse. So a very quick recap. As I said, I always bring this into conversation just so people are aware, and just as a reminder of what constitutes domestic abuse. So types of abuse, obviously the one that comes into mind most commonly is physical abuse. But as we all know, domestic abuse isn't just about physical. It's also about psychological abuse, financial abuse, coercive and controlling behaviour, stalking and harassment, and not forgetting as well honour-based violence, forced marriage, and online digital abuse. So because coercive control, I would say, is the most difficult form of domestic abuse to recognise, and it's certainly the most difficult form of domestic abuse to get conviction for, I'd just like to go through some examples of what it is. Now, I will say that coercive controlling behaviour has only been a crime in the UK in recent years, so it's still fairly new. And now, more recently, there was a new crime in place under the Domestic Abuse Act to look at coercive control post-separation. So if you've left an abusive relationship and the abuse is still active and going on, then coercive control post that relationship is a criminal offence under the Act, and it's punishable by a custodial sentence if we get conviction for it. Coercive control massively looks at the way you are controlled in the relationship. So there might not ever be any physical violence. However, that person may be in fear of violence if you're not doing what that perpetrator is asking you to do. So it might look at controlling finances. People might not have access to their own bank accounts. It can be repeatedly putting someone down so they believe they're worthless. They'll never be able to get anybody else. You might be deprived of basic needs such as food, being monitored online. We've had quite a lot of issues recently with people having spyware put on phones, tracking devices on cars, having to be accountable for every minute of every day and checking with that perpetrator. The amount of clients I've seen where perpetrators will video them at various parts of the day so that perpetrators can check that the partner is where they say they're going to be. They'll have to prove that either by a photograph or video. Any sort of control that's exerted that just doesn't feel safe and secure for the other person. They might be isolated from friends and family. It might be that they're deprived of medical services, or that person then can go to medical appointments but might have to be escorted by that perpetrator. So there's absolutely no sense of privacy. As I mentioned before, there might not be any physical violence, but there may be threats made, intimidation, unreasonable demands, and some of the time denying access to children. So when I've just mentioned that coercive control post-separation is now a new crime, often if there's children involved, perpetrators will use children to continue to control the situation. They might still have financial ties, so control can be exerted there as well. So I would always say, if anything like that is present when you are coming face to face with people in the community and anything like this is mentioned, I will be always encouraging people to log this with the police. Now, it might seem like a small matter to that person. It's most certainly not. Even if it seems like a really small, insignificant thing to that person, it's still affecting their daily life. And what I would encourage you to do is get it reported, because what you are doing in that moment is you're building up a picture of evidence. So if you need to go to court, whether that be for a criminal case or if it's a civil matter, if you're trying to get a civil order in place, all the police logs will count as evidence, which is vital. So under the new Domestic Abuse Act, children will be recognised as victims of domestic abuse automatically, whether they have been present at the incident or not. We all know that children are affected massively by domestic abuse, and the trauma can have a long-lasting effect on their lives. So children will be victims of domestic abuse if they see, hear, or experience any effects of the abuse and they're related to person A or B that we discussed previously. Now, I do have a little video here that people can watch at their own leisure when this is circulated. It's just a 5-minute clip, and it does talk a little bit about some of the effects that domestic abuse does have on children. So it's worth a watch if you've got a few minutes spare just to watch that. But some examples of how domestic abuse can impact on children. It might be that they're hearing the abuse from another room. It might be that they see someone they care about being injured and or distressed, finding damage to the home environment. So there's a bit of a scuffle. It might be that they've come in to find bits of broken furniture all over the place. Often you will find that children, if the parents or caregivers are being physical, get into a physical altercation, it might be that they try to step in and intervene and they can directly get hurt by that, or just indirectly not getting the care and support they need from the parents as a result of the abuse that's going on within the household. So whether they're present or not at the incident, as I've mentioned, they are now victims of domestic abuse under the Act, and it's important that that's recognised and that children do have a voice. So just before I talk about the Act a little bit more, just some numbers for you from Oldham. So numbers of high-risk cases are gradually rising year on year. And I always like to emphasise that when we talk about high-risk cases, high risk means that a person is at risk of significant harm or death. So it's really up there and really quite serious. So these are the numbers of clients that have been referred to our service as high risk. And we do also deal with low and medium as well, but just in terms of those at merit level, which is our high risk cases. So between April 21 and March 22, we had 875 clients coming through deemed as high risk. And then April 22 to March 23 this year, that's risen to 1,172. So unfortunately, year on year, statistics for domestic abuse are getting worse. So looking back at the Act, what does the Act aim to achieve? So it aims to promote awareness, to put domestic abuse at the top of everyone's agenda, and raise public and professional awareness, which is really important, to enhance the safety of victims and the support they receive, to pursue and deter, to provide effective response to perpetrators, from initial agency response through to conviction and how they're managed, even including following release from prison, to try and deter them from reoffending, and to improve performance, to drive consistency and better performance in the general response to domestic abuse. So in a moment, I'm going to look at some of the ways that the Act tries to achieve that. So one of the things under the Act, and quite a new thing as well, is there's been a domestic abuse commissioner appointed. So the aim of the commissioner role is to hold organisations, which is ourselves, police, health, and the government to account. So that person is employed to ensure the response to domestic abuse is consistent across the whole country, and it gives victim survivors a voice as well, so they can be heard and acknowledged. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through some of the key aims of the Domestic Abuse Act, and then what I'll do is I'll go into a few of them in a little bit more detail, just to give a bit more of an explanation. So the Domestic Abuse Act 2021, as I've mentioned in the first slide, the main aim is to categorise domestic abuse as not just physical violence, but all the other forms of abuse that we've looked at previously, and just to raise awareness that domestic abuse comes in many forms, the main aim being that people can recognise it and respond to it when they come into contact with the victim. So I've also touched upon some new criminal offences. So we looked at coercive control. It's now a crime post-separation. Non-fatal strangulation is a fairly new crime as well. And this is quite a biggie for me, because the amount of police referrals we get coming through, and it's got on non-fatal strangulation. And sometimes there's a tendency that that's not overlooked, but not given the importance that it should. Because if you are attempting to strangle somebody, you've got in quite a serious position. And for me, if you're putting your hands around somebody's neck, your intention could be to kill that person. So although it may be non-fatal strangulation, the intent was there, and that should be treated extremely seriously. So when you're going out seeing people and they may talk about physical abuse, there's often signs, you know, they might have marks around the neck, they may have bloodshot eyes. So just to look out for some of the signs. And if anybody discloses that they've been strangled or there's been attempted strangulation, it should always be taken seriously and police involved. We have lots of clients where, unfortunately, there's lots of threats to disclose private sexual images, especially with social media now. People use that as a bit of a weapon, but that is seen now as a new criminal offence. And it's, again, that's something that we need to be aware of. So if people are disclosing it, they're aware that by law it is a criminal offence. So what the police do routinely is provide things like DVPNs, they're called Domestic Violence Protection Notice Orders. So if they respond to a domestic violence incident and they believe that victim to be high risk, if the offender should stay in the property, then what they will do is they will issue one of these orders, which means that the offender must stay away from that property for at least 28 days. Now, that doesn't seem like a massive length of time, but what it does do, it gives us as IDVAs the opportunity to go into that house and talk about other longer lasting orders that we can get in place, things like non-molestation orders, which we talked about on the last episode. So it's really good, because if that wasn't in place, ordinarily, we might not have time to get in and speak to that victim because the perpetrator would be in that property. So it just gives you a bit of time for that victim to think about what they want to do moving forward. So that's something that's encouraged under the Act. It's a good thing for people to know about. And it can be requested from police if we find that it hasn't been put in, and it probably should have been. So under the Act, we've got Clare's Law, and I'm not going to talk about that now because I'm going to go on to that in a moment. But there is a ban on GPs as well for charging for medical evidence of domestic abuse, which is a really good thing, because medical evidence, especially if there's been physical altercations, is massive in trying to get convictions. So there's new legislation around housing and how they respond to victims fleeing domestic abuse. I'll also come into that in a moment. And generally just making the court process easier for survivors of domestic abuse. So this is where I'll go into a little bit more detail about some of the things that I have mentioned. So in the court process, so if there's been a police incident, that victim has given a statement and is now wanting to go ahead with the prosecution, the hope will be that the evidence will be put forward to the CPS and will have grounds to try and get that person convicted with a criminal offence. So often we support in our service victims who go to court, and they go to court as witnesses. And obviously that's a really scary and intimidating time. So to try and make that as easy as possible under the new legislation, the hope will be that special measures are considered for each and every witness attending court. And what I mean by special measures is that in court we might have a screen up so that victim can't see the perpetrator when giving evidence. They might be able to come to the court via a different entrance to avoid bumping into the perpetrator. If you've got someone vulnerable, we do work with vulnerable adults, and it might not be appropriate to go to court for them. And if there's children involved as well, we can set up things like video links so that person doesn't actually have to leave their home and it's less traumatic for them. So being eligible for special measures, unfortunately, doesn't mean that the court will automatically grant them. However, I will say that they always do the best. I don't think I've ever really had something refused when I've supported somebody to court, if it's going to be the difference between them being able to stand up and give it evidence or not. Most courts will grant those measures. So in the past, perpetrators have been able to cross-examine victims in court, which has been awful. I've been witness to a poor lady, victim of horrendous crime, having to stand there and be questioned by her abuser, which you can't imagine anything worse, can you? As if it's not intimidating and nerve-wracking enough. So under the new law, under the Act, that has now been prohibited, which is such a relief, because it's not a nice thing to have to witness. So I did touch upon Clare's Law just when I was talking a little bit about the Act. So it's the Domestic Violence Disclosure Scheme, and most people will know it better as Clare's Law. So Clare's Law came into place in 2009, and it was supported by a man called Michael Brown, whose daughter Claire was murdered by her ex-partner. And the days that followed the murder, it came to light that Claire's ex-partner had an extremely extensive violent history. But due to a loophole in data protection, nobody gave her that information. So Michael Brown, Claire's dad, felt that had Claire been given this information, it could have prevented her death, basically. So as a result of that, Claire's Law came into place, a really, really valuable scheme, which is still able to get the information today. So there's two parts to the scheme. There's a right to ask and there's a right to know. So when I talk about right to know, if the police come across evidence of a perpetrator's violent past, and they are aware that they are living with another person and that person is at risk, they may choose to disclose that information to that person if they feel that it's going to help support them and put them at less risk if they know that information. The right to ask is, so if you are with a partner and you are worried about their behaviour, then you can contact the police directly to request some information on their background. Now, that background will only be in relation to domestic abuse. It won't be, if they've got an extensive criminal past, it won't be everything they've ever done. But if it's something that's going to affect you in terms of domestic abuse, they can choose to disclose that to you. It's quite useful as well if someone has been in a domestic abuse relationship and all the trauma that comes with that, and then they eventually move on to a new relationship. Some people have done that once they've entered into a new relationship due to fears of going through the same thing again, which I would always advise 100%, just to check out if that person has got a history of domestic abuse. So the way you can access the disclosure scheme is to simply ring 101 and request it over the phone. Greater Manchester Police do have their own website, so you can just go online and do it online also. So those are the two methods primarily used to access Claire's Law. So when you're coming across people who might be talking about their other halves and some of the worries they've got, or if they've got into a new relationship, that's something I would absolutely always advise. So talking a little bit more about housing support and how our local council, Oldham Council, can help support victims of domestic abuse. So there is a guarantee that all survivors will be in priority need for housing and will keep a secure tenancy in social housing if they need to escape an abuser. So if somebody needs to flee the property there and then, what we can do, obviously it's not so easy just to put someone in a permanent property. We all know the situation with housing and availability, but in the very short term, what we can do is we can look at emergency accommodation for that person. Anybody fleeing domestic abuse is entitled to that emergency accommodation, which might be a refuge, it might be B&Bs, it's whatever's available within the council at the time to keep that person safe. So if that person makes the choice to move in their own time, this is where the first bit of that slide comes into play, and they will automatically, if they're bidding on properties, be given a priority banding. So it might be if that person's in emergency accommodation, they're still having to log on to the council website to bid for properties just while they're waiting for something permanent to come up. But to reassure them, they will always get the priority banding. And also as well, if people aren't feeling safe in the Oldham area, which is often the case, especially if their abuser is also in this area, it's quite a small town, quite easy to bump into people. People have the right to flee to any area that they want to go to. Housing, when you're moving to a new area, in normal circumstances, will usually say you need some sort of family connection to come here. There needs to be some connection to the town, whether it be a new job, you've got family there. But in terms of domestic abuse under the Act, it's important to know that there doesn't need to be any connection because you are fleeing for your safety. So that person has a right to apply online to another authority, or they can go and turn up at housing as well, whichever they prefer, and they've got a right to do that. Because you do get some housing associations in various areas that will still challenge that. But as long as you know the law, you can obviously talk that through, because there shouldn't be any barriers to put up to someone trying to flee domestic abuse. One thing the council does in response under the Act to domestic abuse is looks at the sanctuary scheme. So if someone's experiencing domestic abuse, I've spoken previously about this, we always give people choices. We never try and enforce our thoughts on somebody else. If you as a victim are not wanting to leave your property, then that's absolutely your right and your choice. We would never, ever, ever expect somebody to up sticks and move if that wasn't the right thing for them. So what we try and do is keep people safe in their own properties if that's what they're wanting to do. So the council run a sanctuary scheme where community safety will give that person a call. They will run through the current security on the property, whether it be, have you got a house alarm, have you got locks on your doors, bolts on your doors, things like that. And then they will present with a survey. So once we get hold of that survey, we will then send that to the appropriate housing provider, who will look at the work recommended and look at what they can fund, basically. If that person is in a private rent, then we will have to get permission from the landlord. We do have a small pot of money when that person isn't in a council property to fund some of the work ourselves. So it doesn't mean because you've got your own property, you're just stuck. We can still look at making changes to some of that property. So it looks like things like reinforcing external and internal doors and windows. We put window alarms on, window locks on. We might look at security lighting outside. Recently for a lady, she was terrified that somebody was going to jump over a fence because she had really tiny fences. So we even got some funding to make those fences higher. We can't run, unfortunately, to things like CCTV just because it's the council and you know what it's like with the council and funding. However, we have been able to provide people with things like the Ring doorbells, the internal cameras, just so they've got that peace of mind and extra security and evidence as well if that person was to turn up at the property. So again, this has been mentioned in previous training sessions, and you're thinking, God, Kate, you're banging on about this again. But it's because it's so important. I always talk about the one chance rule. So the one chance rule looks at the belief that there might only be one chance to speak to a potential victim, and therefore you've got one chance to save a life. I always say, especially in circumstances where there's honour-based violence, potentially multiple perpetrators in the family, when I talk about coercive and controlling behaviour, about that person having no privacy, no control over their own life, it might be very difficult for them to get away from that perpetrator. So if you have someone that's had the opportunity to disclose domestic abuse to you, they might not have another chance. It's as important as that, basically. So how you respond to that is absolutely vital. So even if you're absolutely stuck and you think, God, I have no idea what to do with this disclosure, and if the only thing you do is give us a call, then that to me is extremely helpful for that person, because we can give them the right tailored support and help that they need. So I'll put the phone number, as I always do, at the end of this presentation. So when someone is experiencing domestic abuse, it's vital to make an accurate and fast assessment of the danger they're in. So we do that by completing our referral form, which if you've watched previous episodes of this, you'll know that's our dash form. We do have a separate dash training as well, which runs throughout the year, which is a really good thing to come on. Our dash is basically a series of 24 questions, and it looks at the element of domestic abuse and what's going on for that person, and we assess the risk from the responses that person gives. So when I talk about high-risk referrals, it all boils down to the information that has been given on that referral form, which I think is really, really important. So if you see any training in relation to the dash, it's a really, really good thing to go on to. But if people want to give us a ring and want more information, absolutely, you're more than welcome to do that. And our contact number for our service is there now, 0161 770 1572. Alternatively, we do have a central email address, which is checked every day. We have IDVAs on duty Monday to Friday, 9 till 4. Anybody, if somebody discloses domestic abuse and they can't talk there and then, I've talked in previous episodes about difficulties, especially if there's risk and the perpetrator is about to return. Even if the only thing you do is give them this number, people are able to self-refer into our service. So it might be that they've disclosed it's not safe to carry on that conversation because the perpetrator's due home, or it might be that they're monitoring the whereabouts. So if you're able to safely pass over this number, they can contact us if they get an opportunity to do so. I would always advise as well, if you're passing a number over, that they save it something really discreet in the phone, whether it's dentist or something really, really generic, so it doesn't arouse any suspicion.